Hello and welcome to Paul's Thorn, a podcast that explores disability in the Bible, its stories, meanings, and impact on faith, with the goal of examining how Scripture portrays disability, challenge common interpretations, and offer fresh theological insights. My name is Angela Vincent, and thank you for joining me today. So I guess it's been a little bit, about a month since the last time I recorded the podcast. So a lot's been going on, though I guess quite a bit that was school related and travel related. So that's calming down a little bit. And so I find myself having the opportunity now to spend the summer, I'm still working, but other than that, to be able to have a little more personal time to do things that I like to do. And so that's been a nice change. As I record this podcast, it's Mother's Day, so that's also an interesting period for me. My mother's passed, as I've discussed before, so that makes Mother's Day always a bit of a challenge. So I thought, too, this would be a nice way, doing this recording, to maybe get my mind off some of that and thinking about her a little too much, or being too emotional, I suppose, about that. So I alluded to having more opportunity to do more fun things, but most of what I've been focused on recently has been trying to catch up with some things that had slid a little bit when I was so focused on getting my schoolwork done. So some of that's organizing the house and getting things cleaned up, but a lot of it has been more physical focused, in that I think for the last year since I was in classes, I hadn't been doing very much exercise, which, getting older, that's something you definitely need to be doing. And so I think, too, I had a bit of an injury in my left shoulder, and so it's made it a little more challenging to lift and do certain positions without having some pain. And so I think all of that combined made it where I wasn't exercising as much. And so that's been one of the things that I decided to go ahead and tackle now that school is out. I have an Aptive app, and I hadn't been doing it for a while. So I decided to kickstart this week and do everything that I had in there every single day, with the goal of getting gold star for 7 days in a row as a way to get started again and working out. And so I just need to do work to finish today, and then I will have gotten my gold star for the week. So that's been good. I've been sore constantly ever since I started this particular project. But on the other hand, I think it's been good in getting me, again, back into doing more physical exercise and getting, again, in better shape than I was. As I was doing yoga yesterday, as a matter of fact, I was trying to do what was being asked for in the Aptive, but I literally wasn't physically able to do some of the positions. I would lay there like a dead bug on the yoga mat trying to figure out how to actually get into position. So again, incremental change and progress, not perfection, but I think it'll be good for me again to move more towards that. Last night was fun. There was a gala that they had as part of the nonprofit that I serve on the board for, Sherwood Community Services, and they serve a number of counties here in the northern Puget Sound. It's an area actually that doesn't get a lot of service providers in comparison to more South Sound like Seattle. And so it's nice to have an organization that does serve the community up here. So I've mentioned them before, but essentially the focus is on early intervention, really helping kids to make sure that they get on the right foot right from the beginning. And then after they graduate high school, helping with employment services so that they can work if that's what they would like to do, and support them in making that transition to being employed. So they have a big fundraising gala every year, and so it was last night. The theme was the Kentucky Derby, which I didn't really dress up as far as the theme went, but it was nice to go there and hear some stories from folks who have been positively impacted by the support they get from Sherwood. And just in general, to be able to support an organization that has a mission that I believe very strongly in. So that's been a lot of fun. So yeah, just in general, it's been an opportunity or a chance recently to have a little more relaxation and not be so driven and focused on school and work. And so I think I'm going to really enjoy the summer. So with that said, I guess I'll go ahead and get started on the main theme of this episode. Today we're walking alongside one of the most moving resurrection stories in the Bible, and the walk or the road to Emmaus, found in the Gospel of Luke chapter 24. There is a mention of it very briefly in Mark, and so I'll be reading that along with the Luke version. But I had first heard about this story through a coworker who had participated in a 3-day church retreat over a long weekend. And so at the time, I had never really, I'd been going to church for years as a child and then did speed reading of the Bible and got through it. But for some reason, this story never really stuck with me until she had described portions of it to me, just in general, the Bible version of it, but not what actually happened in the retreat. I got the impression that was supposed to be a secret unless you'd actually gone to the retreat. But it was enough to for sure make me very intrigued about this. And so it's something I've thought about over the years. And while it's not exactly aligned to disability, I think in some ways it is. And also, just in general, I think it was good after Easter to discuss this story in a little more depth. So again, I'll be reading the story from the Bible, but first I wanted to set the stage of exactly how we are getting to this particular story in the Bible. And so essentially the story is that there's two followers of Jesus who are traveling after the trauma of crucifixion. And so the followers of Jesus, he's just been crucified. Now they're trying to understand what that means for them and for their movement. They're grieving, they're confused, they're exhausted, and they're uncertain about what exactly the future is going to hold for them. So as they're walking to Emmaus, a stranger joins them on the road. So they don't recognize him at first. As a matter of fact, they don't recognize him for quite a while. But through a conversation, shared experience, and eventually the breaking of bread, they realize that they've been talking with the risen Christ all along. So again, I'm going to start first with the passage from Luke, and then I'll real quick read the passage from Mark. Again, it's a lot shorter version of the story. So from Luke chapter 24, verses 13 through 35. This is from a section called, appropriately enough, The Walk to Emmaus. Let me backtrack a little bit. I didn't say it before, but in order to do the research for this episode, I used ChatGPT along with Google and Google Gemini. I also specifically this time went to a website for the Upper Room, which does the Walk to Emmaus or the Emmaus retreats. And I'll be reading from the NRSV version of the Bible. So the Walk to Emmaus. Now on that same day, two of them were going to a village called Emmaus, about 7 miles from Jerusalem, and talking with each other about all these things that had happened. While they were talking and discussing, Jesus himself came near and went with them. But their eyes were kept from recognizing him, and he said to them, "What are you discussing with each other while you walk along?" They stood still, looking sad. Then one of them, whose name was Cleopas, answered him, "Are you the only stranger in Jerusalem who does not know the things that have taken place there in these days?" He asked them, "What things?" They replied, "The things about Jesus of Nazareth, who was a prophet, mighty in deed and word before God and all the people, and how our chief priests and leaders handed him over to be condemned to death and crucified him. But we had hoped that he was the one to redeem Israel. Yes, and besides all this, it is now the 3rd day since these things took place. Moreover, some women of our group astounded us. They were at the tomb early this morning, and when they did not find his body there, they came back and told us that they had indeed seen a vision of angels who said that he was alive. Some of those who were with us went to the tomb and found it just as the women had said, but they did not see him." Then he said to them, "Oh, how foolish you are, and how slow of heart to believe all that the prophets have declared. Was it not necessary that the Messiah should suffer these things and then enter into his glory?" Then, beginning with Moses and all the prophets, he interpreted to them the things about himself and all the scriptures. As they came near the village to which they were going, he walked ahead as if he were going on. But they urged him strongly, saying, "Stay with us, because it's almost evening, and the day is now nearly over." So he went in to stay with them. When he was at the table with them, he took bread, blessed and broke it, and gave it to them. Then their eyes were opened, and they recognized him, and he vanished from their sight. They said to each other, "Were not our hearts burning within us while he was talking to us on the road, while he was opening the scriptures to us?" That same hour they got up and returned to Jerusalem, and they found the 11 and their companions gathered together. They were saying, "The Lord is risen indeed, and he has appeared to Simon." Then they told what had happened on the road and how he had been made known to them in the breaking of the bread. And so then here's the version for Mark. For Mark 16, verses 12 and 13, from a section called Jesus Appears to Two Disciples. After this, he appeared in another form to two of them as they were walking into the country. And they went back and told the rest, but they did not believe them. So again, that's a lot shorter version of the story. So to focus again on the Luke version, and the part that's always intrigued me is when the text says that Jesus interpreted to them the things about himself in all the scriptures. So while we know that exact conversation obviously was not recorded, and we don't really know exactly what he said, most biblical scholars believe that Jesus likely connected passages from the Hebrew scriptures that pointed towards suffering, deliverance, resurrection, and the coming Messiah. Today we'll be talking about those passages, or those potentially used passages, and the themes that Jesus may have discussed with the two on the road. So the first theme is Moses and the Exodus, and the idea of liberation through suffering. So Jesus may have connected his death and resurrection to the story of deliverance in the book of Exodus. And we know for sure, obviously it says here, that he spoke about Moses and the other prophets. But some of the themes that he may have been elaborating on when he was at least speaking about the Moses part of it was this idea or a theme of slavery to freedom, of God walking with oppressed people, of the idea of salvation even in what appeared to be impossible circumstances. The Jewish folks didn't really, I guess, believe they had a way out or a way to escape the oppression of the Egyptians. And so how they did manage to escape that was truly extraordinary. From the Passover to the Red Sea parting to then the wandering in the desert to being fed for the 40 years. It's all a very... If you were to be told that story, it was a very incredible story. And so, again, despite those very incredible, difficult circumstances, they did ultimately get saved. And then they continued again in that wandering through the desert for the 40 years, journeying towards this promise of the promised land and what they would receive from God for basically, I guess, that journey or for their trouble. So the Emmaus Road itself echoes Israel's long wilderness journey, essentially a confused people walking toward hope while struggling to understand God's plan. So from a disability standpoint, it's interesting that you can say that maybe some disabled people have felt like they've lived through a similar wilderness experience. I know that I have at times described my life pre-diagnosis as being a wandering in the wilderness. And so some of that can be the idea of waiting for access, waiting to have confirmation or understanding of why you are going through the experiences that you are going through, how to navigate systems like social systems or school systems, whether it be like getting services or figuring out IEPs, and how to survive social exclusion. A lot of times if you have a disability, it's not as easy to be included in friendship networks or in school. I know a lot of, I'm basing this on being on Reddit sometimes, but I'll hear the experiences of younger autistic folks and definitely feeling like they have been excluded or not part of a community for much of their lives. So I think that's not unusual for a lot of folks with disabilities. And then also the enduring of chronic illness or just the idea of uncertainty. If you're wandering in the desert for 40 years, that's a long time to not really know how it's going to come out or what to expect. So the Exodus story reminds listeners that God's presence is not limited to moments of victory, that God travels with people through difficult terrain. So another story that Jesus could have shared with the folks on the walk to Emmaus is the suffering servant story from Isaiah. So again, many scholars believe that Jesus likely referenced the book of Isaiah chapter 53, which describes a servant who suffers, is rejected, and bears pain. So I'm going to go ahead and read that book. It is a touch longer, but I think it's a good one in general to talk about, especially when it comes to Christ, since it paints such an interesting linkage between the Old Testament and the New Testament. So again, chapter 53. Who has believed what we have heard, and to whom has the arm of the Lord been revealed? For he grew up before him like a young plant, and like a root out of dry ground. He had no form or majesty that we should look at him, nothing in his appearance that we should desire him. He was despised and rejected by others, a man of suffering and acquainted with infirmity. And as one from whom others hide their faces, he was despised, and we held him of no account. Surely he has borne our infirmities and carried our diseases, yet we accounted him stricken, struck down by God and afflicted. But he was wounded for our transgressions, crushed for our iniquities. Upon him was the punishment that made us whole, and by his bruises we are healed. All we like sheep have gone astray. We have all turned to our own way, and the Lord has laid on him the iniquity of us all. He was oppressed and he was afflicted, yet he did not open his mouth. Like a lamb that is led to the slaughter, and like a sheep that before its shearers is silent, so he did not open his mouth. By a perversion of justice he was taken away. Who could have imagined his future? For he was cut off from the land of the living, stricken for the transgression of my people. They made his grave with the wicked and his tomb with the rich, although he had done no violence and there was no deceit in his mouth. Yet it was the will of the Lord to crush him with affliction. When you make his life an offering for sin, he shall see his offspring and shall prolong his days. Through him the will of the Lord shall prosper. Out of his anguish he shall see. He shall find satisfaction through his knowledge. The righteous one, my servant, shall make many righteous, and he shall bear their iniquities. Therefore I will allot him a portion with the great, and he shall divide the spoil with the strong. Because he poured out himself to death and was numbered with the transgressors. Yet he bore the sin of many and made intercession for the transgressors. So again, the key ideas in this chapter are the idea of being despised and rejected, of being acquainted with suffering itself, being misunderstood by society, yet ultimately vindicated. So the disciples expected political triumph, and so Jesus is basically reframed the idea of the Messiah and what that meant through suffering, and then the idea of sacrificial love. From a disability standpoint, very often disabled people have historically been treated as if they were less than, to be pitied or hidden away or viewed only through a suffering narrative. But Isaiah is reframing what woundedness means. The wounded figure is not abandoned by God. And this can open an important discussion for Christians about how churches can often misunderstand what disability is, assuming weakness means spiritual failure, when it's something that, again, in the Emmaus story, we're learning that there's a quiet challenge to that, in that very often, again, being wounded or having a disability does not mean it being abandoned by God. It can be essentially carrying out what is God's mission and God's purpose for you. A third potential topic that may have been discussed by Jesus with the two folks on the road to Emmaus with him were the Psalms of Lament. And so there's a couple of books and Psalms that I'm gonna read part of them. The first one is 22, and so we also know that the verses of 22 are something that was repeated by Jesus as he was on the cross dying. And then 31 is very similar. So I'm going to read again the two passages. The first one will be Psalm 22, verses 1 through 5. And the section is called Plea for Deliverance from Suffering and Hostility. To the leader according to the deer of the dawn, a psalm of David. My God, why have you forsaken me? Why are you so far from helping me, from the words of my groaning? O my God, I cry by day, but you do not answer, and by night, but find no rest. Yet you are holy, enthroned on the praises of Israel. In you our ancestors trusted. They trusted and you delivered them. To you they cried and were saved. In you they trusted and were not put to shame. Again, it's an interesting kind of call back, I guess, to the Moses idea and then deliverance from the Egyptians. So then I'll read the next one as Psalms 31, and I'll read verses 1 through 10 from that chapter. Title for this passage is Prayer and Praise for Deliverance from Enemies. To the leader, a psalm of David. In you, O Lord, I seek refuge. Do not let me ever be put to shame. In your righteousness deliver me. Incline your ear to me. Rescue me speedily. Be the rock of refuge for me, a strong fortress to save me. You are indeed my rock and my fortress. For your name's sake, lead me and guide me. Take me out of the net that is hidden for me, for you are my refuge. Into your hand I commit my spirit. You have redeemed me, O Lord, faithful God. You hate those who pay regard to worthless idols, but I trust in the Lord. I will exalt and rejoice in your steadfast love, because you have seen my affliction. You have taken notice of my adversaries and have not delivered me into the hand of the enemy. You have set my feet in a broad place. Be gracious to me, O Lord, for I am in distress. My eye wastes away from grief, my soul and body also. For my life is spent with sorrow, and my years with sighing. My strength fails because of my misery, and my bones waste away. So again, I'm going to read the whole thing, obviously. But these psalms include different themes around grief, abandonment, confusion, trust amid suffering, and eventual hope. So it's important to remember that the disciples on the road to Emmaus are grieving. They're in there in shock. They're trying to figure out why what happened to Jesus and the events that just played out did happen. And so Jesus does not silence their lament. He walks with them within it, allowing them again to process those emotions and to understand them, but also bringing them back to this hope that we see in both of these psalms. So from a disability connection or perspective, lament is deeply important in disability theology because disabled people are often pressured to stay positive, appear inspirational, hide pain, or avoid expressing frustration. Biblical lament says grief can still be faithful. So the next major area that Jesus may have discussed with the two disciples on the road to Emmaus was resurrection and new creation. Jesus may have pointed towards passages about restoration and renewed life, such as the book of Ezekiel and the valley of dry bones, the book of Daniel and resurrection hope, prophetic promises of renewal. The resurrection of the Bible is not about pretending that suffering never happened. Even when risen, Jesus still had his wounds. But what we're seeing is that resurrection is still, again, a hope for the future and a hope for renewal. And so that idea of having that hope despite maybe a negative experience, hopefully not one that would kill you in the context of this conversation, at least, and with disability, is that the resurrected body of Christ is not erasing history, nor is the experiences that one may carry on their body erasing their history. It's more displaying, let's say, a transformed history. So many disability theologians see profound meaning in the idea of the resurrection and the resurrected body of Christ, in that scars, limitations, and embodied experiences are not obstacles to divine presence. And then the final theme we'll be exploring that potentially Jesus spoke to the two disciples on the road to Emmaus was reinterpreting power itself. So Jesus probably helped the disciples understand that they misunderstood what the Messiah would be. So many of them may have had a more militaristic or political viewpoint of what they thought the Messiah would be, in that it was someone who would help them break Roman oppression, potentially overthrowing the Romans themselves and moving them out of their country. They were an occupied country at that point. They may have also had this idea of the Messiah being more an actual king on earth, someone who would take over the government. again and can lead from that standpoint. And so that's not who Jesus was. And so there's a lot of confusion trying to understand and reconcile, I think, what their ideas of what Jesus was versus the idea of what he actually is. And so again, they expected domination, and Jesus instead revealed servanthood to them. They expected conquest, but he revealed companionship. They expected immediate victory, but Jesus revealed transformation through suffering and love. So again, those are things that they weren't expecting, and so walking with them on that road to Emmaus and having the opportunity to lead them through the Old Testament and then create that connection to the current circumstances and what Jesus had experienced and what, the lesson to be taken from that experience, gave everyone time to understand better who the Messiah was and what the message going forward would be. From a disability standpoint or connection, then, modern culture often values things like independence, productivity, physical strength, speed, control. It's more shining a light sometimes on ability in context of expectation as opposed to maybe a differing ability or different ability than folks were expecting. So again, the Emmaus story points towards a different kind of kingdom, one built on relationship, mutual care, hospitality, and shared humanity. I guess in some ways that kind of ties back to the disability thing too, where sometimes the kind of kingdom that you think you're going to have or the ability you think you're going to have are not necessarily, again, what you originally thought going into it, but a recognition instead of who you really are and what your abilities actually are. So in that way, the Emmaus story and the perspective it teaches us about managing expectations essentially resonates strongly with disability justice and with disability theology today. So as our final message today, as we leave the road to Emmaus, we are reminded that the teachings of Jesus were never centered on power, status, or perfection. Again and again, Jesus moved toward those who were weary, excluded, overlooked, grieving, and burdened. He taught that the kingdom of God belongs not to the strongest, but to those who are hungry for mercy, justice, peace, and love. I would probably also add those who are hungry to know God himself. On the road to Emmaus, Jesus does not appear as a conqueror demanding recognition. He comes as a companion. He listens before he speaks, and he walks beside people in confusion and sorrow. He opens scriptures not to shame the disciples, but to help them understand that God is still present even in their suffering. The walk to Emmaus reminds us that faith is not about pretending pain does not exist. It's about discovering that love, dignity, and hope can still be found within difficult journeys. And perhaps that is the invitation of Emmaus for all of us, to become the kind of people who walk with others the way Jesus walked with the disciples, patiently, mercifully, and without leaving anyone behind. So thank you for joining me today for this discussion. I think, again, it's been something I've wanted to look into more and understand better ever since I was first intrigued with the whole concept of the 72-hour retreat. I'm not sure why I haven't spent more time before now looking into it. I think sometimes everything, finds or has its purpose in its own time. I guess I'm paraphrasing that in a not very eloquent way. But maybe it was time for that particular discussion, so that's why it's been in my mind recently. So I'll be back in a month to talk about something that I didn't really think about until I came across it this week. Or I guess I didn't think much about it until I came across it this week. And that is the night that Jacob spent wrestling a mysterious figure, could be an angel, could be God, at Peniel. And so I thought it was an interesting point, an interesting story, maybe to explore in more depth and share about. So until then, remember, you do not walk alone. The road may feel uncertain, but companionship, dignity, and hope are holy things. Keep walking in grace, keep making room for one another, and keep believing that even on difficult roads and journeys, God is still drawing near. Goodbye for now. Paul's Thorn, episode 19 by Angeli Vincent. Copyright 2026, all rights reserved.